David Mcdonald is going to be our moderator today, and if you have not visited with David, I would encourage you to do so. He, don't hold it against him, went to UCLA for his undergrad and came out relatively unscathed. And then he decided to try to defy the odds and also went to Columbia for law school and came out and
slightly scathed.
Still relatively unscathed. He did some amazing academic work as one of the editors for
the Business Law Review.
The Business Law Review, thank you. But one of the things that I found the most amusing on his resume is he also pointed out that he was the president of the craft brewing club there at Columbia. So I'm not really sure which one he's more proud of, but
It was definitely the beer.
But with that, I'm going to let David introduce our panel. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here, and we're excited to hear what you have to say.
Great. Thank you, Kristen, and thank you everyone else for coming out today. Thank you for coming to MSLF's panel discussion on expertise versus accountability. Is the administrative state at war with democracy? So that's not a loaded term for our panel at all. But I'd like you to please help me in welcoming our two panelists. To my immediate left is Erin Taylor. Erin Taylor is the Executive Vice President of the Sutherland Institute. The Sutherland Institute is a nonpartisan policy and educational institution based here in Salt Lake City. It works to advance principles of public policy that promotes the constitutional values of faith, family, and freedom, remains true to the belief that every generation must recommit to the principles that make us free. Erin joined Sutherland this year, so congratulations, September 18th, I believe. Yeah. This year, and after nearly a decade in Washington, D.C., working both on the Hill and in the private sector. While working for Senator Orrin Hatch on the Senate Finance Committee, Erin helped organize more than 30 hearings exploring multiple areas of the federal tax code and wrote speeches advocating for deficit reduction. While working for Senator Deb Fischer, Erin took a lead role in drafting bipartisan optional paid leave legislation that eventually passed as part of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. After leaving government service, Erin joined Grant Thornton LLP, where he served as a Director of Government Affairs, leading the firm's effort to secure equitable tax reform for pass-through businesses, which make up more than 90% of all businesses and affect probably a great deal of the people in this room. Finally, very relevant to today's discussion, he guided the Foundations of Evidence-Based Policymaking Act through the Senate and into law, which requires agency data to be accessible and requires agencies to develop statistical evidence to support their policymaking. Christopher Koopman, to my far left, is the Executive Director for the Center for Growth and Opportunity at Utah State University. Founded in 2017, the Center for Growth and Opportunity explores the scientific foundations of the interaction between individuals, business, and government to improve well-being for individuals and society and provide meaningful learning opportunities for students in the Huntsman School of Business and throughout Utah State University. They train students, conduct research with a national network of scholars, and communicate transformative solutions to the country's most pressing issues. As Executive Director of the Center for Growth and Opportunity, Chris specializes in regulation, competition, and innovation, and his research and commentary have appeared in major publications such as the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. He's also a regular contributor to The Hill and was named one of Forbes 30 Under 30 in 2016 for Law and Policy. Prior to joining the Center for Growth and Opportunity, Chris was a senior research fellow and director of technology policy program at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, and he is currently a senior affiliated scholar with the Mercatus Center and a member of the IT and Emerging Technology Working Group at the Federalist Society. Thank you for joining me today, and thank you, gentlemen, for joining.
Thank you.
So to start off with, COVID, the situation we're in right now, has seen America's faith in its experts and expert institutions crumble between early mixed messages from the WHO and the CDC about wearing masks and the dangers of COVID-19 to the public feuding that our own president has had with his policy experts. This whole period has put expertise, the very concept of centralized expertise, bureaucratic expertise, to the test. At the same exact time, we're relying more and more often on the authority of experts in order to justify our public policy decisions. So it really feels like more and more we're in a courtroom type situation throughout the entire country where the best anyone can muster is a paid expert parroting the party's talking points. So getting into that, how did we get here? The founders didn't seem to have placed an administrative state in charge of our governance. What in the Constitution, what in the framing kind of puts us in this position?
That's a great question. I think the founders would be appalled, obviously, at the size and growth of our federal government. I think your last point there that you just mentioned, I think, is critical, because I think politicians want to justify their decisions. They know it will have such a large impact. They know it can be devastating to the economy. And so they want to be able to point the finger to someone else who's brighter, has spent more time on this issue, and so they can point to their local Department of Health as saying, hey, this is what we have to do. Now, I personally I should say at the outset, everything I say is under the hat of Aaron Taylor. Sutherland Institute hasn't written anything about evidence-based policymaking, so this is all my own professional experience. But I think that does raise a lot of questions as to why they want to point the finger, and they don't say that, but we know that's all happening. To justify shutting down businesses and shutting down the economy, all candidly because due to peer pressure. To your earlier point about the foundations of our government and how do we get to this point? I'm only 38 years old. I have no idea. I was thinking about this earlier today. Obviously, as time went on, and with each subsequent president, eventually we would have another branch of government, and another branch of government, and another branch of government. And Chris may be able to recall how many branches we started off with. Not branches, sorry, departments, agencies. We still only have 3 branches, just for clarification.
Maybe we only have 3
I'm not so sure about that.
But with each additional agency comes its own workforce, which eventually grows and grows and grows. And I think it does raise a lot of great questions.
Yeah, I can just build on this point, but first I really want to thank the Mountain States Legal Foundation for the invitation to speak. There was very little right now that would get me to leave Cache Valley, my beautiful corner of the world, but to come speak with all of you about some of these really, really important issues. Got me to put dress clothes on for the first time in months, leave the valley, interact with society, and be with you all. But to the point you were just making, I think to go back to the founders' intent, you cannot get a clearer message of what the founders intended in the separation of powers than Federalist 47, right? Mm-hmm. James Madison has said this, right? The accumulation of legislative, executive, and judicial power into one branch is the very definition of tyranny, right? It's the very definition of tyranny. Now, I would agree with Chief Justice Roberts when he says that calling the administrative state the very definition of tyranny may be a bit much, but it's not totally inaccurate, right? You think it really has become a headless fourth branch of government, right? Both in its scope and its practical independence, right? The idea that the President of the United States could be at war, essentially, with his own experts gives you just some sense of just how disconnected executive branch agencies and executive branch employees have become from the chief executive of the United States. And I think the dangers that poses can't be dismissed. I really do think we've drifted far away from the founders' intent of the separation of powers when you think Congress has delegated massive amounts of legislative authority to these agencies, right? You think that they more communicate moods than messages, right? As the Supreme Court would say to agencies, they say things like, make credit safe, make markets competitive, make consumer products safe, right? These very just broad, amorphous charges to these agencies. And then the judiciary through a series of precedents going back to the mid-1980s, have just deferred more and more authority to these agencies, so much so that in 2013, right, you have the Supreme Court essentially delegating interpretive authority to agencies to decide for themselves what the scope of their statutory authority is, right? So it isn't just enough that Congress has made credit safe, but the judiciary has now said it's up to that agency to decide what that means. And we've just deferred. So now you have, legislative, judicial authority combined within executive branch agencies that I think is the very definition of the type of things that James Madison was warning about in Federalist 47. So I think when it comes to the CDC and the president at war with his experts, that's like the most popular iteration. This is where like the public has now seen it for the first time. But most of us in this room, I think, would all recognize that it's materialized in many, many different ways for many, many years. This is not a new thing. This is just one now that has grabbed the nation's attention.
So what I'm wondering is something that I hear a lot is, well, the world's a lot more complicated now than it was in 1787. The government needs to do a lot more. Would it really be a better system if we had 435 windbags in Congress deciding how many parts per million of lead is in our drinking water? The founders themselves were men of science. These were men that were experimenting with new evidence-based forms of policymaking that had never really been done before. And if they had lived in our more complex, interconnected society, wouldn't they just be the same people that we're railing against now? They were no big fans of direct democracy, for sure. I mean, we have the Senate that was originally not elected. We have a Supreme Court that's not elected. We have a cabinet that's not elected.
Well, so to that point, I think as I was in Congress, for 5 years working both for Senator Orrin Hatch on the Senate Finance Committee and Deb Fisher in her personal office. I was born in Utah, raised in Nebraska, so I like to say I served both constituencies. I found it fascinating the various careers that members of Congress had. So while yes, to some degree on the nightly news, they can seem like windbags because they're messaging. Each of them really do have areas of expertise. You'll meet, I'm thinking of a congressman from Pennsylvania whose name I'm forgetting, but had a dozen car dealerships, and another one from Florida who had car dealerships and understood the automotive market like no one else. And others who were lawyers, and others who were dentists and doctors and taught at medical schools. And so what I found actually somewhat gratifying, initially I was hesitant in Washington, D.C., was all these lobbyists throwing information at you. But really, if you're the congressman who sold tires and got elected, and another congressman, was a cattle rancher from Nebraska, as Senator Deb Fisher was, you don't know the other's expertise. And so the real value I found with federal lobbyists, which eventually I became one, was educating, really just telling stories and teaching members of Congress about other industries. And that just provided immense value. And so while, yes, on the news they can seem like windbags, in the halls of Congress and in those rooms, they are learning a lot about every single industry every single day.
Yeah. So to the point of like the delegation of maybe, let's say you do have experts in Congress who have delegated legislative authority essentially to career bureaucrats in an agency. The question is whether or not the expertise you've witnessed in the halls of Congress it translates to expertise within these agencies, and they have very, very different incentives, right? So if Senator Fisher gets something wrong, she hears about it from her constituents, right? Very, very clearly and loudly. When a lawyer at the Securities and Exchange Commission decides to do something, right, whatever that thing is, and wield the authority of the United States federal government to do something without any public accountability, that there's a different question of whether or not he or she even has an incentive to rely on their expertise, right, or to achieve something else, right? People are people, right? Yep. People are self-interested individuals. Traditional market processes take that self-interest and turn it into, mutually beneficial exchange, right? I want to make money for my family. You want something that I have. We trade. Bam. Beautiful, wonderful thing. That same self-interest remains in human beings when they're in executive branch agencies, right? And when they're in independent agencies, and when they're in these roles, and they have the same self-interest, right? To accumulate power, to be, more, to just quite frankly have more authority, right? People enjoy this. This is like a innate human instinct, is to be in charge of things. This is like, ask any third grader on a playground, right? They'll tell you they want to be in charge. But the question is, right, like what constraints were there originally that ensured that these experts in agencies remained focused on the larger task at hand, as opposed to some very, specific self-interest or some focus on building their own jurisdiction or their empire, or what keeps the FTC and the FCC from fighting over who has jurisdiction over a particular merger acquisition, or the DOJ and the FTC from fighting over the same type of thing. And some of this is just completely unconstrained, right? It doesn't matter the level of expertise. It's just unconstrained self-interest within a lot of these agencies. And, this started with, conservative judicial principles, right? I mean, you think the level of deference at the Supreme Court, right? Go back to Marbury v. Madison. The Supreme Court has said since the beginning, right, that it is the purview of the courts and the judiciary to determine what the law is, period, right? Like, that's it. And yet, beginning in the 1980s with, a series of opinions authored by Justice Scalia and so forth through, the mid 2013, you still had building this line of precedent that deferred all of this authority, right? The checks and balances that were envisioned, the court should be in a position to check an agency when they exceed their jurisdictional limits of what Congress has delegated to the executive branch to do. They haven't done that. And they've done that in, under the guise of A, separation of powers, and B, they've said, look, Congress wants agencies to have discretion, right? It would grind government to a halt if, Senator Fisher or Senator Hatch or, any of the 500 some odd members of Congress had to legislate every exact thing that an agency needed to do for every specific instance, right? They delegate that because it's practically unwieldable, right, to do that. And Justice Scalia, in defending, this is Chevron deference for the lawyers in the room, for those of you who are not lawyers, this is a whole line of cases where the Supreme Court has just time and again said, courts will not question an agency's interpretation in light of congressional ambiguity, right? If the legislation's ambiguous, the Supreme Court, and all Article 3 courts will delegate or defer to the agency's interpretation so long as it is not unreasonable, right? It has to be reasonable, and who knows what that means. But they've said, we want the agencies to have this deference because Congress has deferred to the agencies, and the courts want to respect that. But what you've gotten now is this instance, and you have expert agencies that are acting in ways that, quite frankly, what passes for expert within an agency would not pass for expertise within the industry, right? So you have people who are regulating industries in which they have no practical understanding of what that is, right? I mean, just the latest example of this is, you have people floating the idea in the Federal Trade Commission of breaking up Facebook, right? Now, whatever you think about the politics of Facebook, Facebook is not AT&T, right? The value of Facebook as a company are the people, right? There's no physical infrastructure, maybe some servers, right? And there's a server farm here in Utah that is, that Facebook runs, but you can't, to break up a tech company in that way just completely misunderstands what that industry is and what that company is. And I think that is just an example, but one of many examples that could be brought up of just what passes for expertise in an agency would not fly in an entry-level interview at these companies for expertise of what these companies do.
Right, and I want to touch on expertise and how we define expertise a little bit later, but you touched on something with incentives and the self-interest kind of will to power at the agency. And I'm curious about why we don't see that sort of self-interested incentive, will to power type of thing happening with the courts and the legislature, since much of what the original protections, checks and balances in the Constitution were built upon this assumption of ambition checking ambition. And really what we've seen here, the explosion of the administrative state, is a sort of the legislative and the executive in cahoots together because it works out better for everyone. So I wonder if, especially you, Aaron, with your time in Congress, can you speak to the incentives that cause Congress people to act this way when I'm sure it must be significantly more nuanced than just, oh, they want more time for fundraising. There's obviously more to it than that.
Sure. And two, I think your point, Chris, earlier is very valid. My point on the members of Congress learning from lobbyists and learning from other members certainly does not make them an expert in any industry. But to answer your question, the incentives really are on pressure on time from constituents. We need this bill now. We need to save this industry. We need to eliminate this particular tax credit. Or we need to create this tax credit because our industry is hurting and it's uncompetitive with another. And so there is a lot of pressure on staff to write a bill, get it out the door, get it on the Senate floor, build a coalition within the state, build a coalition from other states, meet with bipartisan staff, add co-sponsors, and try and get it in the next moving vehicle, whatever that moving vehicle is. And so as a staffer, you certainly see and feel that. And you cited the example of paid leave. And one of the examples I actually wanted to share today was that example. I came into Senator Fisher's office from Senate Finance Committee. I was told, we really want this, Obama was still president at the time, we really want to take the ball away from President Obama on paid leave. Democrats are always out there touting paid leave. Republicans are for families. Republicans have male and female voters. What can we do? Well, let's create a bill, let's create a tax credit that would give smaller employers, not the Fortune 500, not the Fortune 1000, that would give small employers some benefit to giving their employees that time off if they had, if a secretary is going to have a baby. What can we do in that instance? And so what we did is we said, okay, well, look, there's already the Federal Medical Leave Act, right, which President Clinton signed into law in 1995, I believe. Let's take those rules and apply them here, and then let's get it. First, we got to get a score from the Joint Congressional Committee on Taxation, which actually took us a whole year because she wasn't on the Finance Committee. They don't return your calls. It takes, when you're on committee, you can get a score within 2 or 3 weeks, maybe a month at max, depending on what's going on. But the Committee on Taxation, same thing with the Budget Committee, they respond to respective members. So leadership, committee heads, committee members, and everyone else.
So even sitting Congress people have difficulty getting this?
Extreme difficulty. It literally took a call from the senator I was working for to the head of the Committee on Taxation to get us a score. And even then I got a call back saying, honestly, we don't know how to score this. There's not a lot of data out there on which small and medium employers would take advantage of this. Can you help us find some data? And so I was then put in the position of calling around my contacts in Washington, D.C., saying, hey, who would have some data on this? Cobble that together, give it back to JCT, and JCT gives us this tremendous score. It's like $21 billion initially. A lot of money, right, for a Republican senator to introduce. So then we have to tweak the bill. And so I'm working with, actually at the time it was Senator Angus King from Maine. Independent, usually votes with the Democrats, but he jumped on board with us and said, hey, I'm willing to support this bill because I don't believe it should be a mandate. I don't believe we should be telling businesses what to do. Very strong business record in Maine. So he jumps on the bill. I'm working with his staff. We're tweaking the bill. And again, it took, eventually left Senator Fisher's office for this other job opportunity. It wasn't until 3 staffers later that the bill actually had some legs. But to your earlier point, there is always that pressure to play politics or to serve the constituent. And sometimes that means bills get drafted very, very fast and without a lot of expertise.
Yeah, and I think back to your original question in terms of like ambition checking ambition, right? And the separations of power and checks and balances. I think you see, you know, in the incentives of individual members, and even the incentives of like the, you know, members of the judiciary are self-interested in a way that, you know, you can vote for a bill, you can support an agency, and then you can run against the very decisions that you just made, right? You can almost completely disassociate yourself from government, right? In a way that there's this...
And this is by not taking the hard positions on the actual legislation.
By not taking the hard positions, right? By just letting the agency do it, and then Congress can say, gosh, you know, the growth of government goes unchecked. And it's like, well, that's your job, right? Like, you do something about it. You know, you even have, you know, the Supreme Court of the United States, right? And you can see in recent cases around like the ACA, for example, you know, as the decision making was going on and the horse trading was going on among the justices, there was all of this sort of, you know, these rumors that, you know, the outside lobbying going on to the court in terms of like the court's respect, and people saying if they decide this way, they've lost legitimacy, so much so that, you know, in some of these cases, the dissents read like majority opinions, majorities read like dissents because people are flipping at the very last second, and you have like, you know, all these stories about John Roberts deciding against, you know, principle to protect the integrity of the court, right? And all of these things going on, and in ways that there's self-interest clearly playing out. It's just not playing out in terms of the judiciary trying to remain independent and check the executive branch, or the executive branch checking the legislature, and vice versa. It's just not happening that way. And it's not a new trend, right? I think you can go back, and there are these quotes from presidents. I mean, there's this story of President Kennedy on the phone with a constituent, and she's complaining to him about these regulations, right? That you know, she's dealing with, and she's unhappy, and, you know, she gets to the end of her complaints, and President Kennedy says, look, I agree with you, I just don't think the government does, right? This is the President of the United States saying, like, I agree with you, I just don't think the government does. Even Harry Truman was saying the same thing, right? He said, like, you know, I thought I was the President of the United States, but I can't get anything done with these damn bureaucrats, right? Like, literally the head of the executive branch saying, I can't get anything done because of the bureaucrats. Yeah. It sounds kind of familiar.
Yeah, well,
right?
I mean, we joke all the time about how we'd love to see some of that deregulation that everyone keeps complaining about. But yeah, so.
Exactly. Yeah, and I also think, you know, some of this is just far too complicated, right? Like, you've gotten to the point where you have hundreds of agencies, hundreds of thousands of executive branch employees, right? Like, all making up the administrative state, that you can have decisions being made so far removed. I mean, you're talking about how difficult it is to get staffers within joint committees to talk to one another. Now imagine, you know, trying to figure out which person in which sub-basement in which agency signed that memo, right? Or signed off on that guidance that dramatically changes an industry, and no one can figure it out sometimes. I mean, sometimes it's just becomes so unwieldy that, quite frankly, even if a congressman wanted to do something about it, it'd be very, very difficult to track some of these down.
Yeah, and even jumping ahead, I think one thing that I learned from a subsequent staffer was, even after the tax credit had passed, the agency said, well, actually, this isn't quite going to work the way you guys intended to. So in some ideal world, I think it would be very valuable as staff and as members of Congress, before they ultimately hit print or you know, send that bill to the Senate floor, to have a conversation with, and perhaps it's not always the bureaucrats in the agency, because they may be political, they may be from an opposing party, depending on who has the White House, but to say, hey, is this going to work the way we intend it to work? Sometimes that may mean reaching out to the Government Accountability Office or Congressional Research Service to have those conversations. But I think that would help members of Congress to some degree fill in the blanks and not delegate unnecessary authority to the agency.
Yeah, I'd also add to this, and this is just something that I don't think, and you probably know this as a former staffer, but most people don't recognize, is the level of deference that staffers give to agency employees in terms of,
tons.
Pretty much every agency has to be reauthorized at some point, right? Every agency at some point needs to have their reauthorization from Congress completed. And oftentimes, the reforms that others are proposing are run by members of the agency to say, like, how does this fly with you, right? And they say, well, that can't happen. And they're like, okay, red line, it's gone, right? So there is this weird deference even given among staffers to members of the agency. I can distinctly recall a few years ago during the FAA reauthorization, there was a lot of push to change very simple, antiquated rules around like flight sharing, right? Like Uber for airplanes type situations. You're a licensed pilot, you want to fly somebody somewhere, and they want to pay you for it. You legally can't do that. You can't make money off of that as a licensed pilot unless you have your commercial license. Senator Lee's office was trying to change this, and the agency was like, well, you can't do this. And at the end of the day, the agency won out, right? So in many ways, they wield a lot of authority, and they have tools at their disposal that evade complete accountability from the other branches, right? I mean, like this idea of consent decrees, where you can sort of cloak government action in private decisions, where you just, an agency can threaten to sue a company and then say, but we'll settle with you if you sign this consent decree. And then they agree, and it's unreviewable by courts. It's not a rule that Congress can look at. It's an agreement between the agency and the company itself for however many years they decide. I mean, at the FTC, sometimes it's 25 years, right, that a company remains under some of these consent decrees, right. Which, again, it's just evading even the checks and balances. Even if there was a strong incentive among the other branches for ambition to check ambition, oftentimes these agencies have figured out these ways of getting around it.
And along those lines, 'cause I mean, I know when I think of a bureaucratic expert or something along the topic of this discussion, I'm sure many people are, they're thinking of some scientist or someone in the BLM or the EPA or the FCC or something declaring rules that they were that in order to enforce things or try to do something on the agency. But what are these sort of more pernicious or subtle ways that experts have an influence, like you said, through either the deference that staffers show them in the actual drafting of the bills, or even not necessarily government employees? I mean, there's a lot of ways where you have kind of these elite gatekeepers that really create a whole lot of influence, whether it's on legislation, whether from lobbyists or from the agencies that are actually a lot of times serving the similar purposes and educating the staffers, or in sort of context of, say, Facebook or Twitter and getting that sort of Section 230 internet censorship area where you have, okay, what are the experts at these private organizations that have taken on kind of the primary responsibility for regulating the public square. So I was curious if both of you could talk a little bit about kind of these ways in which people use outsized influence when we don't really see that.
You want to take that first?
Yeah, and I think some of this also has to go back to something you said before, and that's like, what do you define as expertise, right? And I think that there are plenty of areas where, quite frankly, the government has experts that are providing a beneficial role, right? I think, in the aviation space, in the work to bring supersonic flight back to the United States, NASA scientists have played a really important role in helping private companies understand things like even how to estimate the effect of a sonic boom, right? Which is important when you're flying supersonic airplanes. You're going to want to know this, right? So I think that's not to say that all expertise is nefarious within government. I think there are plenty of examples of expertise being used to advance our understanding of the world and improve the things that we have. So that aside, I think it also depends on how you define expertise within an agency. So up until recently, every single economist at the Federal Communications Commission reported to the lawyers. Right? Now, for all of us lawyers in the room, we're like, well, of course they should. Like, of course the economists should report to the lawyers. But it created this really backward dynamic in which, a former colleague of mine was the former chief economist at the FCC for a brief period until he was essentially, asked to find other work. But the reason why there was so much conflict with him is he was exerting independence. He's saying, like, the thing you want to do as a lawyer looks good and is legal, but it's bad policy. Like, it's just, the economics does not support your legal determination of this situation. And they said, so what? We'll just find another economist within the building that will agree with us. And that's the incentive that was created, right? So there was all of this expertise, but the incentive as an economist within the Federal Communications Commission, until just a couple years ago, they finally created the Bureau of Economics within the Federal Communications Commission. Like, they finally said, you know what, maybe they should be independent. Like, maybe like what you were saying, maybe experts shouldn't be treated as expert witnesses, but should be treated as objectively expert in an area. And for a long time.
That makes me get the question now is we live in this, as people are fond of saying, a post-truth world where you have people who are like, well, can I really trust the CDC? I don't know. So I guess that's another question, is how much trust should we be placing in, I guess, both accreditation, reputation? How should we be measuring this? Who should we be listening to, and how do we figure that out? Because I don't know who to listen to.
I don't know. I mean, like, accreditation to me, like, just letters behind your name. No offense to anyone who spent a lot of years in postgraduate education, but a lot of letters behind your name does not equal expertise, right? There are plenty of people who have a ton of expertise that didn't get it from a university or a college or something like that. So I think, again, government does depend on, in many ways, someone's credentials, right? You think, oftentimes they want a doctor to run the FDA, right? This doesn't necessarily have to be the case, right? Like, you don't need someone with an MD to do these things, or a PhD to do these things, or, I think currently every member of the Federal Communications Commission and the FTC are lawyers, right? They all have JDs. You don't need a JD to know what competition is. As a matter of fact, like, maybe being a lawyer should count against you. Maybe again, no offense to the lawyers in the room, but, like, maybe credentials should count against you, and expertise should be counted in different ways. Like, have you actually done anything in this industry?
I wouldn't mind having a plumber on the Supreme Court or something. Like, just have someone with that gut check to be, whoa, guys. I know we're all smart people, but come on, let's take it back.
And this is, look, as someone who treats the Supreme Court with a great deal of reverence myself, personally, Lino Grella, constitutional law professor from the University of Texas, said, I may be getting this wrong and misattributing the quote, so if I'm wrong, you can tell me, but I think he said he would trust the first 9 names in the Kansas City phone book to make decisions for his life than the 9 members of the Supreme Court and the amount of authority they have to make decisions. And I think that's right. Like, sometimes the people who have academic experience in government lack practical experience. And that's why you see this disconnect of, agencies telling businesses that they have to do a thing that it reads really well on paper, but doesn't play out in an industry at all, because it's been commanded by someone who hasn't spent a day in that industry. So again, I think it's just how you define expertise is really going to go a long way in helping you understand who you should and shouldn't trust. Right?
I think that's an excellent point, and I probably can't say amen loud enough. But I guess two quick examples. One, if we did go down that road where expertise is all that matters, then it becomes a competitive game of which institutions have the best expertise to grant the PhD, right? Is a Yale PhD better than a University of Colorado PhD? Is it? And would the hiring agency determine that? And then we have to trust that, then it really does become even more elitist. And I don't think we want to go down that road. And on the point of practical experience. I was just thinking about this morning as I was talking to someone who has an undergrad, already has a master's degree, working in politics, has an opportunity to go work in the state capitol, but wants to go back and get a law degree. And I just thought, I just value that practicality so much. Like working for the speaker of the State House is going to be so much more valuable in terms of your practical experience than learning from books for 3 years. And most people are going to go to law school for 3 years and then say, oh, I really want to work in the Capitol. Well, you have that chance now. Take it.
And I did promise some people that we'd have some time for questions at the end. So just one last thing, so have that in your mind. But so I guess where do we go from here? What do you see if you had a magic wand and you could fix one aspect of how the agencies and the courts and the legislators work together to make a more accountable society? Like if you could do one thing, what would it be?
So I won't speak to the court side because I'm not a lawyer and haven't dealt in that world as much, but I would say on the policymaking side, whether it's the federal or even in the state legislature, I think there would be some value to slowing things down a little bit, bringing in those people who are going to eventually tell you, hey, this law isn't going to work the way you intended, and filling in those blanks. And then having an assessment every few days as a team, is this law doing what we intend it to do? And doing a gut check internally, but also doing a gut check with people both in the agency, but in the business. Talking to those who are the practitioners and saying, does this work? Does anything in here smell odd to you? And if so, what is it?
Can my one thing be a list?
Yeah.
Is that okay?
You have to rank it though.
Yeah, okay. So I don't know if any of you are from Idaho, but the state of Idaho, about a year ago, something interesting happened, and they got caught up in legislative rigmarole, and their entire regulatory code sunsetted. Right? They had to reauthorize every single regulation in the state. They basically got to start from scratch. Like very rarely in government do you just get to flush the toilet, right? Like you just don't get to start with it. Like you just don't get to start over again, right? Very rarely does this happen. Idaho had it happen. I think at a federal level, like the tech policy person in me is like, this is the hard reset, right? When you call IT and they're like, did you try just unplugging it and plugging it back in again? I think our administrative state could use a
Unplug the
hard
United States
reset.
government and put it back in.
Just not the entirety of the United States government, like the administrative state. I think like most of these agencies are 100 years old, right? And most of these agencies did not age like wine. They aged like milk, right? And they've become outdated, right? Most of their regulations are Polaroid pictures of what the market looked like at the time that their organic statute was enacted.
You don't even want to think about how many regulations governing milk and condensed milk from the 1930s you're working under.
Yeah, we don't want to go down yes, we don't want to go down the Caroline Products line of kids. But I do think that if I could wave a magic wand, I would a hard reset. Like, all of you at some point in time have done this. And again, I can't get away from the tech analogies, but you've updated your operating systems, right? At some point, the company you were doing business with said, the things that we gave you no longer work. So let's refresh it. We've learned something. We've patched bugs. We've fixed holes. We've increased our own knowledge as we've seen these things play out. And that very rarely happens in government. And I think even just for an agency, pick one agency and start there and say what would happen to the Federal Communications Commission that was, created when the state of the art was wired-line telephony, right? Now we have an agency that was designed around, the first generation of telephones, essentially, in the 1930s, and now they're regulating satellite internet broadband. Right? It's very, very different. Are they the best suited to do this? I'm not sure, but we've just sort of let it ride because path dependencies are what they are, and it's easier to just let the status quo sink. It's sit than to do something. So that would be my one thing, is like a hard reset. And I also think, a reassertion of Congress as the first branch of government. I mean, I think, like Senator Lee and others have really pushed for this, but this Article 1 initiative to say, the branch of government closest to the people ought to be reasserted as the first of the three branches. And I do think Congress needs to step up and do more. You can't have the first thing I said without the second. So they go hand in hand. So.
Well, along that wavelength, I think one of my dreams has been a newly elected, a newly elected member of Congress getting to the halls of power, and instead of thinking, what new bills can I pass? Saying, what bills are out there that we can just get rid of? And just taking a whole different approach. Because often, I would even find, actually, Senator, that bill, we've introduced 7 different iterations of that already, and none of them have shown any effect. And most staff, some will do that research, but most will just take the orders and run with them. Say, yeah, let's do that bill. That sounds like a great idea. Well, has it been done before? How many times has it been done? And does any of that have any effect? To your point on evidence-based policymaking, that was, I didn't work on that on Capitol Hill specifically, but at the Grant Thornton, we were very active in pushing for that bill to be passed, because we wanted all that data to be public, so that then an agency's, part of the law was the agency would have to have their own data officer, so that then they could then actually test, do some A/B testing. Is this program working? Is it not? And let's tell the public the truth.
Do we have any questions from the crowd? Great. Oh, wait, sorry.
My wife and I were lobbyists at the United Nations for almost a decade, volunteer lobbyists, and we found that the delegates there, for the most part, were pretty clueless. You think that the United Nations, they'd be the sharpest people in the world, but they were there as a delegate because they happened to be the wife of the Prime Minister's brother, and she didn't have a clue. So we as lobbyists, we understood the issues. We could go there and explain things to them, and they really appreciated that a lot. We had a lot of influence by helping them to understand what was going on. I think many of our congressmen are kind of the same thing. They get elected because they just choose to run. They really don't have a clue about the proper role of government, and they get there and they don't really know what's going on. So I'm wondering, what do you think about the role of lobbyists, for congressional lobbyists? Should they be regulated? Should it be open? Should we be encouraging it? Or what is your view on that?
So my view, my experience was very similar to yours. My view was that all the members of Congress would have their independent areas of expertise, and many would run not understanding how deep and how broad the federal government is or has been. And so I think, yes, they certainly need those lobbyists. They need people in there to educate them and challenge some of the ideas that they propose and modify and amend others.
I wonder if we should have a kind of occupational diversity quota for Congress, where it's like, nope, we've got 15 lawyers. Try again next year. Yeah. We need a few more farmers, a few more pharmacy technicians.
Yeah.
Or just if everyone had to take an introductory 3-month course of Economics 101, I think that would be very awesome.
And to your point, lobbying does play an informational role in decision making. I think, oftentimes, people look at lobbying, like the word lobbying, as a pejorative, right? Or lobbyist as a pejorative. But I do think there is an important informational role in getting that information to elected officials. Now, how they use the information is different, right? But to your question of regulating lobbying or something, this is just my personal opinion, but like speaking to your legislator is a First Amendment right to petition your government. And if you want to hire someone else to speak on your behalf, you should be able to do that. And so the short answer is let it ride. That's it.
So actually, on that point, I wonder real quick what your guys' positions would be on, say, congressional term limits. Because that's often seen as one of the biggest criticisms, is that the staffers and the lobbyists will just take more power.
I'm certainly supportive, and I think one thing that you may see, even if congressional term limits were imposed, is that the staff just stay on, right? As one chairman leaves, all the many tax staff would just stay on under the subsequent chairman. And that chairman would dive in on an issue subset that he or she may love, but all of the information that he or she's getting is all coming from the staff who wrote the bill 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and even 15 years ago. So they have their own incentives of staff and so I think if there is a flushing, it should be of both members and to some degree staff, so that there's always new staff coming in. One of my thoughts has been, if I ever decided to run for office, I would actually mandate that my staff have 2 years, basically, the very junior position, and then they go out the door. They either move up to another senator's office, or they go downtown, they go back to business school, they go get some practical experience. I think having that practical experience is so innately valuable when you're designing laws and thinking about the lawmaking process.
I also think in rules like that, you have to understand the trade-offs, right, and the incentives you're creating. So, I mean, research we've done on lame duck congresses, what you find is, in the House, right, in that period, the lame duck Congress, in the period between like an election and then the rollover to the new Congress, in the House of Representatives, you find just people don't show up. Right, so
It's the last month of school. Basically.
It's basically the last month of school. What you do find is like
they get kicked out of their offices. Literally, they have an office in the basement. The cafeteria becomes their office. They set up little cubicles. Their office is gone because they have to repaint it. The office of the painting has to repaint it for the new congressman who's coming in a month.
And what you do find over the last 30 years is some of the two things that you find the most: the free trade. The biggest pieces of legislation that have occurred, like free trade bills and massive spending bills, have occurred during lame duck. So like the ones that would typically get legislators in the hottest of waters with their constituents, whether or not it was good or bad policy, the ones that get them in the hottest water are the ones that, members of the Senate at least, and even the ones that do show up on the House of Representatives, they tend to break with party. They tend to do more things that, their voting behavior changes from when they were needing to face re-election. So I do think putting on term limits, they're just trade-offs, and you just have to trade one off against the other and say which one would you rather dance with here. So.
Let's try.
That works.
Okay, let's try another one. So my question is, this is clearly a significant thing. I mean, we're all sitting 6 feet apart because some expert said we need to. And we got a president whose expert this is that says, I don't really agree with that. And we got Biden saying, I'm going to just listen to the experts, that's it, I don't have to think. What do we do about it? What do we do about it as a citizen? What do we do about it as Mountain States? I mean, this thing's just growing and growing and growing, as you guys have described, and a lot of momentum to keep it that way. Doesn't seem right to me. What are we going to do to stop it?
I can start out with Mountain States if you guys want to.
Yeah, I can't speak for Mountain States, so I'm not going to pretend to, right? So you can take
from our side, I think part of what we do here is we're fighting the judicial deference side. Is every single time we can force judges to think for themselves rather than allowing the agencies to think for them. That's good. Anytime we can hold Congress's feet to the fire with, say, if you're fighting kind of on a severability issue, you say, like, no, Congress, you did it wrong the first time. Go do your job this time. We're not bailing you out this time. Fighting it at the margins where you can find those overreaches of authority where you say, okay, they really went overboard this time. We may not be able to get them when they go a little bit overboard, but if we can just slowly chip away at reining that in through litigation, I think that's a way that we in Mountain States can make a difference.
I would say, I'm not going to advocate against mask wearing. I think they could certainly play benefit in a very crowded room. But I will say to your general point about reopening the economy, I've said this to a very dear friend. I said, I think it's very hard to uninject the fear that the government has injected into everyone's souls. And so how do we do that? It does take work. It's going to take baby coalition building from every individual, calling around the parents of their other friends in school and saying, hey, I don't think they should have canceled recess. I think I want my kid to go to recess. let's go petition the school board. Can you call 5 people? I'll call 5 people. Will Jane call 5 people? Let's go make our case. I think it's going to take that. Activist can have a pejorative word in politics, but I will think it will take that type of activism to turn the ship around.
Yeah, I'm not a doctor, right? So I don't know what the science is, but the process of science is not static; it's dynamic. So it's to be expected that when an unexpected thing happens in the world and doctors are observing it and they say we think X is true, and then they realize X is not true, Y is true. That's science, right? And I think when it was wear a mask, don't wear a mask, wear a mask, don't wear a mask, like there were all of the flipping and flopping back and forth and the inconsistent messages. I think some people just, again, give too much credence to experts. Now, I'm not saying don't trust what people are saying. What I am saying is figure out who credible experts are in a way that, at least me personally, I don't listen to what the FDA tells me or the USDA tells me about what a healthy diet is. I listen to my own doctor. Right? When my doctor says like, hey, Chris, you're in your early 30s and you got high blood pressure and you're a little overweight, here's what you should do. I listen, right? And I think most of us would listen to doctors we know and trust. I think the problem is we've politicized medicine, right, at the highest level. Now, fortunately, the 9th and 10th Amendment are sort of like last bulwarks of this, regardless of whether President Trump or Vice President Biden believe in masks. They haven't mandated masks because they can, right? Like the CDC doesn't have authority to pass these regulations. So the question becomes like recognizing, where are the decisions being made? What decisions should we be listening to, right? Like I think people put way too much credence in the White House and not enough in their local school board, right? I just think that there are some things going on here that like, hey, people are way too worried about what this person is doing when they really ought to be listening to or watching or paying attention to something else. And I just think we've sort of lost that focus. And again, I think it's fear-based. I think it's a misunderstanding of how science works. I think it's, that it's an election year, and so people are just bonkers anyway. It's a whole host of things that I think are feeding into this. That hopefully a lot of lessons will be learned out of this, and people will sort of come to their senses soon.
So what I'm hearing is that federalism is going to save us.
In most ways,
yeah.
Right? I don't think that's going to happen. But, I used to be in the legislative, I was elected to the House of Representatives in Montana. And, I got this great idea for a bill to get passed. So I sent it to Legislative Services, and then they sent it to agencies, and they came back. And it did exactly the opposite of what I wanted to do. And so I gave it back to them, and I said, you don't understand, that's not what I wanted. And they said to me, you don't understand, that's the only way we can do it. And then I said to them, well, you don't understand, I'm the majority leader in the House, and we've got to have it this way. And they said, this is the best we can do. Take it or leave it. So I left it in the garbage can and I didn't send it. But what I'm thinking about here is why in the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House why do these people get an idea and they go with it anyway, and it turns out so lousy, and they can see that it's not going to do what they want to do, but they continue with it. And is this just human nature, or what is it?
I'm not sure that often they can tell it's not going to do what they want it to do that quickly. I think another great change for the legislative making body in Washington would be, okay, let's review all the bills we passed 2 years ago. Are they doing what we wanted them to do? So I would challenge the idea that they can tell that quickly. I think that's, it's disappointing that that story occurred, but I think for federal legislators, they do need to assess, honestly, probably every year, what happened 2 years ago, what happened 3 years ago. let's review these bills. Is it actually doing what we intended? And if not, let's change that. Because ultimately they have the power to do that.
Yeah, I think that in some ways, the general electorate, be it in your congressional district, your, state house district, or, across the entire United States, legislation equals action, right? And if you're not legislating, you're not active. So therefore, you're not doing anything. I can distinctly recall a congressman from New Jersey a few years ago was introduced at an event I was at, and they said he had co-sponsored more bills than any member of Congress that had gotten passed. He had co-sponsored more bills that had been passed than any member of Congress in the last 40 years. And people were, that is so great. You were like the greatest ever, just because people think legislation equals action. So I think, some states have caps on how many bills a legislator can introduce in a year, right? To me, that seems something. I mean, you see like the 1 in, 2 out, right? Like for every new regulation initiated by an agency, they have to cut 2, right? Governor Bevin tried this in Kentucky to moderate success. I think this has been a part of the Trump administration, although I don't think it's actually come to like any sort of real
A little bit
fruition.
early on. I think a lot of it has just been sort of what is the most boring, lazy, do-nothing regulation we can find to get rid of?
Yeah, and it does
Which
actually
isn't
remind
bad
me.
by itself, actually,
Right.
cleaning up
But-
the rules.
Yeah, but it does remind me of like some of these things that I'm even throwing out. Like you don't understand the unintended consequences of what should occur. Bruce Yandel, who an economist at Clemson University, he's written a ton of stuff for the Cato Institute on deregulation. And one of the things that he found, and actually a colleague of mine and I are testing this, is early on in the Reagan administration, so for a long time, the only way you could measure regulation is the number of pages out of the Federal Register, right? Like people would just say like this many pages issued by this many agencies. And so early on in the Reagan administration, they put a cap. They said, as an agency, you can only contribute to this many pages of the Federal Register in a fiscal year. And what Bruce had found anecdotally, and what we're finding actually in the data now that we can do text analysis and you can use computers in ways that you couldn't, let's say, in the early 80s, is that the agencies just got better at writing. They issued the same number of regulatory restrictions, words like shall, must, may, cannot, will not, those types of words. They just did it more efficiently. So like the number of pages went down, but the number of regulatory restrictions continued to climb at the same clip. So you just have to be, you throw out these ideas like, well, how can we better constrain this thing? And it's, sometimes in politics you're doing nonlinear math, right? So you're messing over here, and now all of a sudden something you never even predicted or didn't even think there was a relationship to just spikes on some other end of the page. And I do think that for reforming the types of things we've been talking about, I think it's just one thing to always keep in mind is there's always unintended consequences.
As someone who sues federal agencies, they're very, very good at cramming the same amount of stuff into the smaller amount of pages if they have to. That's from experience on that one.
A little background to my question might be helpful.
Yeah, you're good. I think so.
I spent the first several years in public accounting, and we audited several governmental entities. Then spent 25 plus years in the insurance industry dealing with state insurance regulators in Utah, Missouri, and Arizona. And then another 7 years or so working with behavioral health care bureaucrats here in Salt Lake City. And this kind of goes back to one of your comments about term limits. To what degree do you think the merit system in government employment is a hindrance to progress and better performance? Because it just seems like from the people, and I go back to all those regulators I've worked with over the years, there's a handful, a little teeny handful of those people I would ever consider hiring for the company I was working for. And it just seems like the merit system takes away some of the incentive and some of a little bit of fear for everybody in the private market. Most people in the private market, there's a little part of you that says, if I don't perform, I'm not going to keep my job. I don't think that same fear and incentive exists in government employment under the merit system.
Do we have any Andrew Jacksons on the stage? Are we to bring back spoils?
That's it. You know, Governor Mitch Daniels, who's now the president of Purdue University. He was the governor of Indiana. He was the director of OMB under Bush. He was an executive at one of the big pharmaceutical companies in Indiana before Eli Lilly, before he became governor. He instituted a policy similar to, I think, what you're getting at, and that was actually doing sort of performance-based pay for public employees. So depending on who you were and what your job was, there were different measures that the state had set out to evaluate one's performance, and then your compensation. It wasn't like the traditional public employee that's a sort of COLA, and then if you've got a degree, years of service, all these things, like what you're talking about with public employees, his was truly based on performance. And it was met with a lot of resistance. And I don't know empirically how his proposal changed the performance of government, but it's an interesting point, and I think something worth pursuing. I mean, you have a natural experiment in Indiana. This is probably, I don't know, 10 years ago or so when Governor Daniels did this. But something, at least, someone's tried it. And I don't know maybe I'm a bad researcher. I knew it happened and I didn't study it. But there might be something there to what you're saying as well.
So there's really no hope in getting rid of the merit?
No, I don't know. It depends on the governor and the political situation and what's going on. I mean, you think, Governor Bevin, just taking on certain public employees. I mean, he was a very popular governor one term and then loses re-election, primarily based on the way he took on public employees. So I think it's in terms of lobbying, what we were talking about before, it's a huge base.
Yeah, it's certainly a delicate thing to approach because just on the political nature side, as in the executive branch, if you're attacking them, you're going to get pushed back hard, not only from Department of Insurance employees who might just be a couple thousand in a particular state, but all the teachers will feel like they're under attack because they're all public education as well. But that would be fascinating to go back and find that data and see what happened in Indiana.
That makes me curious is how much of the fact that the federal or state government is usually the biggest or second biggest employer in most jurisdictions, how much of that goes into the fact that just you want to make angry your biggest constituency, really. There's a lot of government workers out there.
Yep.
It's been very interesting. My husband was congressman from Montana and chaired the Appropriations Committee on Health, Human Services, and the whole variety of agencies that falls under that designation. And he too found the problem with being able to eradicate bad legislation is that people have a vested interest in it, primarily within the bureaucracy, because that's their jobs are to administer that program, and they've built up, and then they go to their constituency. And so what he tried to do is say, okay, let's evaluate the programs, let's see which ones are working. If this one's working better than this one, maybe we should take the money away from this one and put some here and then save some. Obviously, it ran into some stiff opposition to that. But it is because of this vested interest. And so when you talk about term limits, instead of term limiting the elected officials, who are in fact subject to term limits by the electorate, having some kind of term limits on the rulemaking bureaucracies. We don't have to do it on teachers and the medical doctors, but those who are in that rulemaking, perhaps those are the ones who should be term limited. So you do see that movement within the executive branch, because that's what got stymied. And in one sense, because it used to be that newly elected executive branch kicked everybody out, and so it was this reward system, and there was some corruption there, and you wanted to give people some security, job security, but does it have to be forever? And is 10 years in a rulemaking job enough?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's an interesting point you make, because there are, in most agencies there are political positions and then there are career positions. And I know this is something David and you and I were talking about this recently is, after the 2016 election, there were legal scholars who were essentially writing a how-to manual for career agency employees for resistance, right? Like how can you, like, here are the tactics and the tools you have at your disposal to resist the president's agenda from within your agency.
It's like those French resistance, like you put the sugar in the gas can and all this stuff.
Yeah, it was literally like a series of things. It's like, well, you can delay. You can just, when the agency's asked to do something, just don't do it. Or you can go faster, right? You can move so fast with your things that essentially the Eisenhower executive office, like the cabinet level people cannot keep up, right? You can leak. You can sue your own agency. Like they were literally outlining these things that I think in some ways, right, back to what I started with, is we do in fact have, a fourth branch of government. I mean, this is a faceless fourth branch of government that exists outside of political accountability, right? People think we should have term limits for Congress, but people don't realize that you could have someone at an agency that has been ebbing and flowing in terms of how much they turn up or down their own personal agenda based on who's in office for, 6, 7 administrations maybe, depending on, what role they had when they started. That there is something I think to the idea of limiting that, and you have some experiments that have done this, like, anyway, I think there are some interesting things there, but there's certainly, I think, something to the idea that there does exist this like fourth piece of government that can grind things to a halt if they want, right, in a particular agency.
Yeah, I'll preface this with my own personal experience right now, but and I think you just hit on it for a little bit, but over the last 3 years, I've been dealing with the Department of Interior quite a bit and been in and out of the offices, working with the department and Fish and Wildlife Service. And there's this dynamic between political appointees and career folks that I think deals with a lot of what you just talked about, this grinding to a halt because of the career implications of those that are working there that have been there through several different administrations. And specifically some that I've been dealing with at Fish that have been there as far back as the Clinton administration, and dealing with the political appointees that are there right now. And it's disastrous. I mean, I guess my question is there a way to deal with that? Because those careers seem to be untouchable for the most part. The politicals come and go, as we've seen, particularly through this administration, fairly frequently. But careers never do. They last forever, it seems like.
That also, don't forget that, an agency cannot spend a dime unless it's been authorized by Congress, right? So,
except for the CFPB.
Well, there is the, yeah, okay, so, okay, there's an exception to everything. Okay, that's why you don't talk in absolutes. So nearly, so there, in the 70s, there was, as it had become clear that the FTC had sort of overstepped its role, you had sort of this resurgence of the idea that maybe like breaking up big companies just because they're big is not the goal of the Federal Trade Commission, and you had this back and forth with Congress and the Federal Trade Commission. You did in fact have a number of years in which the U.S. Congress did not authorize the agency for longer than a year. This is a 1-year reauth, right? And said you're going to have to come back again. And that's, in some ways, that was Congress sort of pulling the reins in and exerting its constitutional authority over an executive branch agency in sort of the envisioned roles of the branches and checks and balances. So I think in some ways it's not going to be fixed by more career appointees, and it's not going to be fixed by who the president is. As I mentioned, Truman, JFK, and President Trump all sound exactly the same when they talk about administrative agencies and bureaucrats. I think most of this is going to have to come from, Congress reasserting its role in terms of just, authorizing dollars and statutorily authorizing these agencies in a way that doesn't allow them to drift the way that they have.
We have time for 2 more.
I was going to say, I think I saw 2 questions.
My question has to do with the Endangered Species Act. It took place in Nixon administration. My understanding is it was supposed to be federal lands only in a certain number of species. It has a sunset that took place in the middle of the 90s. The agency has continued to expand where it's at into private property that we know today it hurts the economy in nearly every part of the U.S. And our Congress refuses to look at it. Why is it still going? Because most of them do not even know it's sunset. I've had a lot of politicians come through trying to get to Congress. Senators, same. You ask them if they know that. They don't know it. Even you got the ones that have been there, they don't know it. And as long as Congress still gives money and the agency continues, how do you correct something of that? You need somebody or some way that the agency cannot continue to expand the program without being looked at by the elected officials.
I think that raises a very good point. 2 thoughts, I think. One, can Congress set up a system and adhere to it whereby they are going to do that? Because Congress changes, right? So one of the thoughts on the on one of the jokes in tax law was that, well, yeah, we can cut taxes today, but that doesn't mean they're going to be cut forever, right? They could be increased in 1 year, 2 years, whatever the session is. So I think creating that system is a question. Is there a way to incentivize Congress so they're always double checking that? And I guess the second thought would be, and I don't have experience with looking at anything with endangered species or how agencies are expanding their authority, but would there be ways within the executive branch? Would the Office of Budget and Management, would OMB of Management and Budget have power to set boundaries for certain agencies so they can't do that?
Yeah, so I think the Endangered Species Act is a great example. I think, the recent attempts to redefine waters of the United States is another example of this, in which you have agencies that are truly trying to reach into every nook and cranny physically of the United States, right, to define small bodies of water in such that, like, your pool could potentially be defined as a water of the United States under the most broad reading of the regulations. And I think, right, we talked a lot about what can be done from the inside out, and I think there is a ton that can be done from the outside in. And I think this is where organizations like Mountain States Legal Foundation and other public interest law firms can put that pressure on courts, can put that pressure on, because you aren't just fighting in courts of law. The organizations like this are fighting in courts of public opinion as well. So I think everything that mission-driven public interest law firms can do to raise this awareness, and such that, like, a congressman can only claim or feign ignorance so long if it's on the front page of his local newspaper, if he's hearing about it, or if someone's asking him at an event, why is Mountain States Legal Foundation suing this agency? And he's like, I don't know, I have to look into it. That, in some ways, is an external check on government, right? And ensuring that courts take their roles serious, ensuring that agencies are taking their role serious, and ultimately, hopefully, in some ways, bringing us back to our original envisioned separation of powers across the 3 branches. But I don't know how you could fix it from inside. I think some of these things just do, in fact, require external pressures.
The reason I know it's still in place, that it did actually sunset, was I asked Tim Scott when I was visiting with him, and he was running. I said, when you get there, look into that. And I've seen him since then, and he said, you're right. But nobody ever does anything about it.
I think there's fearful of public pressure. If you say, I'm going to challenge or curb something about the Endangered Species Act, it's just, that's horrible. You want to get rid of, you want to let the animals die? People take the extremes.
All right, this will be our last question.
Take us out.
Thank you. So I work with the coalition at the state legislature, and we are a nonprofit organizations. So we are very concerned about the overreach of governors and mayors and legislators when it comes to emergency powers. So I would just like to ask you what you think we can do as far as reining in this overreach of it's unconstitutional actions that are being taken, we believe. And also, just a sidelight, I understand that Amy Barrett has ruled in favor of quarantines, of lockdowns, of mandatory vaccinations. So I'm just feeling like from the citizens on up, we have forgotten what the proper limits of government are, and that we as adults can figure out how to take care of ourselves in this pandemic. If we're afraid of going out in public, then we can stay home. It's just the mandates, the masks, and all these sorts of things. I would just like you to address what you think we can do to rein in elected officials.
Let me comment in reverse order. I will agree with you that as adults we should take care of ourselves. To your second point, I haven't read her opinion, so I can't comment on that. On the first point, I asked, because in the state of Utah, the governor has continued to issue these emergency orders. And I asked someone from it wasn't the governor's office, it was a friend of a friend who knew. I said, why are we doing this? And he said, it's so that the window to federal funding is still open. So I wasn't aware of that, but that was the answer I received. I'm not sure if that helps.
Oh. And I would add, so outside the context of the current health crisis and the public responses, I do think that declaring a state of emergency for months on end, even in Utah, and listening to Utah legislators talk about this, that was not in the legislation that was passed in Utah that gave the governor the power to declare a state of emergency. It was for a time-bound period, right? So these indefinite states of emergency, but outside of the current state of affairs in the world, we have states of emergency that have continued since 1979, right? There's a state of emergency that President Carter issued during the Iran hostage crisis, which has stayed in effect and has been re-upped every year by every subsequent president through today, right? And that's just one of dozens and dozens and dozens of federal states of emergency that have been declared. I mean, I don't know if you know this, but in the United States, we're operating under something like 36 different states of emergency.
We looked at this earlier in the week on our
White
pre-call, and I think it was 36, 37 ongoing emergency resolutions.
Federal.
Some of them 40 years old, right? And I do think, to a certain degree, that if you have an emergency 40 years later, right? Like an emergency is like your house is on fire. An emergency is not that's an emergency, right? Emergency 40 years later is not an emergency, right?
You don't call an ambulance for your type 2 diabetes.
Right, yeah. Right. It's like more so a chronic illness than an emergency or something like this. But again, I don't know what the solution is. And again, I do think that's where, mission-driven public interest law firms, right? Look, David did not tell me to say this. This is just something I'm saying. That's the role that organizations like Mountain States Legal Foundation can play, right? Because the legislature doesn't want it. No one wants to be the person that said, turn it off, and then something happened. And they were like, see, we told you, right? And now you have to run for re-election while everyone says you were the gal or the guy that caused all these bad things to happen. It's the same with the Endangered Species Act, as you're saying. No one wants to be like, you're the one that caused the thing that made it so we can't have, polar bears anymore. right? Like no one wants to be that person.
Or
They
some
haven't-
weird species of grasshoppers. Like, it wouldn't even matter.
Yeah, or
Mosquitoes.
a butterfly or whatever. Like, politicians have an incentive to like be unduly risk averse, right? So overcorrect always because it's really hard to prove a negative. It's really hard to prove what couldn't have happened. And I do think that's where like external pressures from organizations, that when there is, you know, constitutional overstepping happening and violations occurring, that organizations step up and ensure that such violations are rectified in courts of law and public opinion.
I think the real solution is going to be the fact that, like, you know, you hear is you don't make decisions when you're angry, is outside of the actual time of emergency. There's going to have to be a bunch of people in a bunch of states getting together and amending their state constitutions to do away with these types of emergency powers. I think long term, I think we're really going to need some sort of structural constitutional change on this point.
And though we are running just a smidge over, I'm going to take a moment of executive privilege because it wouldn't be an MSLF event if Mr. Rumpf didn't weigh in also. So, Mr. Rumpf.
Gentlemen, this has been very, very interesting, and thank you for coming. But in a way, I'm wondering if maybe we are victims of experts ourselves. You guys are the experts.
I thought about how to deal with that with the advertisement and stuff, because we
Well,
use the word expert at least 2 or 3
I do.
times in that pamphlet.
I do. I've heard from both of you, and Mr. Equipment said, "I'm not sure how I can fix it, how it can be fixed." I think were almost your exact words. I think there's an ultimate question here. Do you believe that the idea of the democratic republic with electors from the general populace has become an anachronism in this age of information?
Are you asking me directly?
Say it one more time.
Both of you. I mean, you can't fix it. We have a system, of course, the democratic republic with elected representatives from the general population trying to do a job, which nowadays seems much more difficult in this era of information technology and so on. Has it become an anachronism? Must we try something else?
I think slavery.
Short answer, no. Short answer, no. Right? I truly believe that it has not become anachronistic. I believe that public participation in government, back to the ancient Greeks, has been a hallmark of civilized society. I would also say, you know, for any of you who suffered through the debates earlier this week, there was a quote in there that I actually really, you know, when I could actually make out what the candidates were saying, there was a quote that caught my attention from Vice President Biden, and it was, "Don't compare me to the almighty, compare me to the alternative." Now, in economics, we would call that the Nirvana Fallacy, right? Don't compare a policy to its idealized version, compare it to the alternative, right? What's the opportunity? What's the next best thing if you don't have that thing? And I think is our current democratic republic perfect? No. Would I like to try any of the other forms of government out there? No. I just don't think so. And that would be my short-ish answer.
I think there is still hope. I think there's still hope that the more educated the public becomes on particular issues, the more engaged they become. And so that has certainly been one of the jobs I've taken, and specifically at Sutherland, that is one of our goals always, is to not only engage and educate policymakers, but really to engage the public and make sure the public and the constituencies are informed. So therefore, they're putting the pressure on the legislator.
Yeah. I'm going to take moderator's prerogative and take the last word and respectfully attack the premise of the question. I think you ask a congressman in 1852 whether his job is complex, and I think you insinuate that their job wasn't complex. I think they would be very, very angry with you. I think we've been dealing with very, very difficult, complex problems since the origins of the Republic, and while there's a little bit more numbers involved maybe this time, I think the hard questions of governing haven't gotten any harder, I would say.